Hello, today's poem we're considering is My Life Closed Twice Before Its Close by Emily Dickinson. Before we start, if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, it would be greatly appreciated if you would. Thank you so much. I have the poem here, so let's start. My life closed twice before its close. It yet remains to see if immortality unveil a third event to me. So huge, so hopeless to conceive as these that twice befell. Parting is all we know of heaven and all we need of hell. Although a short poem, being an Emily Dickinson poem, we know that there is a lot contained within it and plenty to unpack. So let's start. This short poem by Emily Dickinson deals with the pain of loss. It is one of her final poems, written at a time in her life when, like most of us, she contemplates death and the existence of an afterlife. She packs a great deal of reflection into 8 lines, comprising 2 quatrains. Written in the first person voice makes the poem deeply personal. Also, it's reasonable to conclude that the poet and the speaker are the same. It begins with a perplexing statement, paradoxical in construction, a riddle of sorts that puzzles the reader, yet intrigues. We know from the start that this poem needs reading several times to make sense of it, and we puzzle how life can close twice before its final closing. Drawing on our knowledge of other Emily Dickinson poems, it's reasonable to conclude that close is a euphemism for death. The lines, "It yet remains to see if immortality unveil a third event to me," reflect the writer's uncertainty in an afterlife. This uncertainty may strike us as unusual, given that the USA was religious, with many people believing in God, a soul and an afterlife. However, the speaker's uncertainty is reasonable, and what lies beyond death is something we have all sometimes considered. If, placed at line 3 start, reflects her uncertainty whether there is immortality after death. She is uncertain. If there is an afterlife, the answers she seeks will be revealed, unveiled, at a third event. This meaning when she dies. She finds present contemplation of whether life continues after death futile. So huge, so hopeless to conceive. The intensifier, huge, stresses the enormity of figuring out what happens to us when we die. Hopeless highlights that the speaker believes it is a futile task to speculate whether there is an afterlife and what it would be like. In stanza 1, the poet uses the metaphor of a veil or curtain that separates the living from the dead, life from the afterlife. While she acknowledges that it is hopeless, impossible to know what happens after we die, times of grief at the loss of a loved one offers insights. These insights are provided through the profound emotion we experience at the death of a loved one. The mourning, grief and bereavement at the time and beyond. These emotions provide an opportunity to contemplate our own death and if there is a heaven or afterlife. Grief provides an insight into hell because of the profound pain the death of loved ones brings to bear. Immortality is a central theme and is highlighted with Dickinson's trademark eccentric capitalisation of an abstract noun. Dashes also a trademark of her style, create a conversational tone that complements the first-person voice. However, her conversation seems not to be with the reader, but with herself, as she contemplates huge concepts and her apparent insignificance in the grand scheme of life and death. Being written in her later years adds poignance to this realization and acceptance that death remains mysterious and life's suffering equally enigmatic. Only death will provide her with answers. Death may bring total closure of her existence, or be the portal to an afterlife where life's mysteries are unveiled, revealed. The poet alludes to two events, closures, which profoundly affected her. These twice befell, occurred. As these that twice befell, parting is all we know of heaven and all we need of hell. Parting is likely a euphemism for the death of two people close to her. Here, parting means that death is the only glimpse we have of heaven and afterlife. She says it is all we know because all else remains hidden until we die. For Dickinson, this is the third event, her own death. The death of others prompts contemplation of an afterlife, but the grief we experience at losing a loved one she compares to hell, and all we need of hell. The pain at the loss of a loved one is hellish. We can speculate that the two previous occasions when her life closed involve the deaths of loved ones. By the time this poem was written, Judge Otis Phillips Lord, with whom Dickinson appears to have shared a passionate correspondence and friendship, had died in 1884, 2 years before her. Other candidates include her second cousin, Sophia Holland, in 1844, when Emily was 14, and Leonard Humphrey, a principal at the Amherst Academy, who died when she was around 20. Obvious candidates include her parents. Her father, Edward Dickinson, died of a stroke in 1874, and her mother died of various chronic illnesses in 1882. However, it remains unclear whose deaths she is referring to. Possibly, Dickinson implies the deaths of the two people who meant so much to her led, figuratively, to her own by draining her life of its vitality. A living death of sorts is one interpretation. However, the poem is open to multiple interpretations. For example, "My life closed twice before its close" suggests two major disappointments in her life were tantamount to death, one being the acceptance that she would never marry and raise children, and thus a closure on a stage of life many people find significant and satisfying. Closure might not mean death. Closure to Dickinson might also mean the physical departure of close friends who left the area and travelled abroad or to other parts of the United States of America. The departure of friends would have been doubly felt by Emily Dickinson, who, throughout her life, seldom left her home and visitors were few. However, the people with whom she did come in contact with had an enormous impact on her poetry. She was particularly stirred by the Reverend Charles Wadsworth, whom she first met on a trip to Philadelphia. He left for the West Coast shortly after a visit to her home in 1860, and some critics believe his departure gave rise to the sorrowful flow of verse from Dickinson in the years that followed. While certainly an important figure in her life, It is unclear if their relationship was romantic. She called him my closest earthly friend. A semi-recluse like Dickinson might consider his departure a closure. Other objects of Dickinson's unrequited love include Samuel Bowles, editor of the Springfield Republican. We can relate to the poem's themes because we have all at some time contemplated whether there is an afterlife. Another theme is how the deaths of loved ones continue to affect us long after, and grief remain undiminished. Equally, death brings acceptance and perspective. Dickinson realises it is futile to conceptualise immortality and an afterlife. The poem implies that grief is a death of sorts, a living death while awaiting final closure. Dickinson provides no comfort or resolution, only acceptance that we must be content to wait for the inevitable, our deaths, to provide answers, if any. The poem's mood is reflective and contemplative. The poet's tone measured, without excessive emotion, reflecting her acceptance. As with many of Emily Dickinson's greatest poems, it is impossible to pin down her poetry to one interpretation. One must accept that Dickinson's poems are fraught with contradiction and ambivalence, and this one is no exception. And these elements within her writing should be considered one of her strengths. Although the poem lacks a neatly packaged resolution, Dickinson places an important message in the final two lines for emphasis. She uses antithesis, contrasting heaven and hell. She implies that the joy of engaging with those closest to us is the nearest we come to experiencing heaven in this life, while the pain we suffer at their departure is the closest we come to experiencing hell. To find out more about the life of this remarkable poet, check out our video on her poem Hope is the Thing with Feathers. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found it interesting and helpful. If so, please hit the like button below. Also check out our other videos on writing and textual analysis. If you haven't yet subscribed to our channel, it would be greatly appreciated if you would. Thank you so much. Until next time, from Carol and me, write well.